Hey friends, if you found your way here because you're trying to make sense of your reactions, your conversations, or the parts of your life where things feel a little harder to navigate than they should be, especially when it comes to your faith, your relationships, and how you show up in them, then you're in the right place. I've been thinking a lot lately about something that doesn't always show up in what we say, but shows up very clearly in what we anticipate before we say anything at all. It's that internal space where a thought forms and almost immediately something else rises up alongside it. Not to express it, but to evaluate it, to shape it, to decide whether or not it should be said and how it should be said, and what might happen if it is said. And the more I've paid attention to that process, the more I've realized that for some of us, it's not just about choosing our words carefully. It's about trying to account for every possible response before we ever open our mouths. It's about thinking ahead, not just one step, but several steps, and trying to anticipate how something might land, how it might be interpreted, and how it might affect the dynamic of the relationship in that moment. And that can happen so quickly that it doesn't even feel like a separate step. It just feels like how we communicate. And you might not even notice it happening while you're doing it because it feels so normal. It can look like pausing just a second before you respond. It can feel like rewriting something in your head before you ever say it out loud. It can sound like a slightly softer version of what you actually meant. And if you're listening to this right now, there's a good chance you've already felt that in your own life. Maybe not in big, obvious ways, but in those smaller moments where you knew what you wanted to say and something inside you hesitated just long enough to change it. It can look like thoughtfulness. It can feel like maturity. It can even be something that we've been told is a strength. But underneath it, there can be something else happening, a quiet responsibility that we carry, not just for what we say, but for how it's received, not just for our words, but for the outcome of the conversation itself. And the more I've sat with that, the more I've started to realize that sometimes the weight we feel in those moments isn't coming from what's actually happening right in front of us. It's coming from everything that we think might happen once we say something honest. Because for some of us, the hardest part isn't saying the thing, it's what we believe might come next. So, last weekend, we were at a church event, and it started really like a normal conversation. We had just sat down to eat, and Kevin ended up sitting with John and me, which is always a bit of a wild card because you never quite know what direction the conversation is going to go. Not because of Kevin specifically, but just in general. Conversations have a way of moving in directions that you don't necessarily expect. And at some point, the conversation had shifted into something that I've been working on behind the scenes, building the Healer and Hope Giver website and creating a place where everything I've been working on can actually live in a way that makes sense. And I was explaining why I built it the way I did and how I wanted it to feel like a place someone could land without feeling overwhelmed, where they could find the podcast, the devotionals, the companion guides, and have a clear next step depending on where they are. Almost like a guided version of those old choose your own adventure books where you can decide how you want your experience to flow based on what you need. And that part was easy to talk about because it's structured, it's thought out. It's something I've been spending time thinking about and building and refining, so I know how to explain that. But then, almost without missing a beat, Kevin brought up something that we'd been talking about before. The idea of starting a video podcast together. And if you know Kevin, you also know that his style is very different from mine. He's incredibly gifted at speaking off the cuff, pulling things together in real time, and teaching in a way that feels natural and fluid without needing to script or plan it out ahead of time. And while I can absolutely see the value in that and I respect it deeply, that's just not how my brain works. Like, at all. So, as he's talking about it, there's this shift happening internally that probably wouldn't be obvious to anyone else at the table, but I could feel it immediately. And it's subtle on the outside because I'm still sitting there, still part of the conversation, still nodding and engaging like everything is normal. But internally, there's this very noticeable shift that happens almost instantly. I can feel it in my body before I can even fully name it. My shoulders tighten a little, my chest starts to feel heavier, and I become very aware of myself in a way that I wasn't just a few seconds before. It's like I go from being present in the conversation to suddenly observing myself inside of it, paying attention to how I'm sitting, whether I'm making eye contact, how I might respond if he asks me something directly. And at the same time, my mind is moving ahead, trying to run through scenarios that haven't happened yet, almost like I'm trying to rehearse something that I haven't been asked to do. What would I say if we actually did this? How would I handle not having time to think? What happens if I freeze in the moment? And while all of that is happening internally, the conversation is still moving, which means there's this strange overlap between what's real and what I'm anticipating. Because it's no longer just a conversation about something I've already built, it's a conversation about stepping into something that would require me to show up in real time, on video, without the structure that I naturally rely on. What if I don't know what to say, or my thoughts don't come out clearly, or I get caught off guard, look like a deer caught in headlights on camera, and say something that doesn't land the way I meant it to? Or honestly, what if I sweat off all my makeup because my body is overreacting? And none of that has actually happened. We're still sitting at the table having a conversation. There's probably food in front of us that I haven't touched, people talking around us, the normal background noise of a room where nothing unusual is happening. And that's what makes it so interesting, because on the outside, everything looks completely normal, but internally, it doesn't feel that way. My mind has already moved several steps ahead, trying to anticipate what the experience would feel like and whether or not I would be able to navigate it well. And it's not just a small jump forward. It's like I naturally move from the first step of something to step 12 without allowing myself space to grow into it gradually. I did the same thing when I started talking about writing another book. I went from, outlining the book to step 12 of, being on a book tour and what that would feel like. And I haven't even, processed it all in real time yet. Instead of, letting it unfold a moment at a time, I'm already trying to account for everything that could happen along the way, as if I need to be prepared for the final version of the situation before it's ever even begun. And when you do that, you're not just thinking about what's in front of you, you're reacting to something that hasn't actually begun to exist yet. And sitting there in that moment, with Kevin and John, I realized something that felt both obvious and a little uncomfortable to admit. Most of what I was reacting to wasn't actually happening. It was everything I thought that might happen. And as I sat with that, it didn't feel like a new reaction. It felt familiar in a way that wasn't tied to one specific moment, but instead stretched across a lot of conversations over the years, where I tried to explain something honestly and realized somewhere in the middle of saying it that it wasn't going to be received the way I meant it. I learned pretty early on, that even when I was trying to express how I felt, it didn't always land as something valid. There were a lot of moments where I would share my perspective or try to explain something that felt like what it felt like from my side, and the response wasn't curiosity or understanding as much as it was correction, not just of what I said, but of how I even felt. And that creates this kind of confusion that's hard to explain, because you can be wrong about facts and assumptions, but being told that you're wrong about how you experience something begins to create this internal disconnect where you start to question whether what you're feeling can be trusted at all. So over time, I adapted in ways that I wouldn't have been able to name back then, but make a lot more sense looking back now. I started trying to say things more carefully, more thoughtfully, more diplomatically, thinking through how something might be heard before I ever said it, and doing my best to remove anything that could be perceived as accusatory or confrontational, even if that wasn't my intention to begin with. And when that didn't seem to work, I tried writing things down instead because writing gave me something I didn't have in real time conversations. It gave me time to process what I was feeling, time to edit what I was trying to say, time to shape it into something that felt measured enough to be received well. But even with all that effort, the outcome didn't always change the way I hope it would. There was still pushback, still misunderstanding, still moments where what I was trying to communicate wasn't actually being received from the place that I was speaking from. And over time, something started to settle in as a belief, even if I didn't have the language for it then. No matter how I said it, I was still going to be wrong. And I don't think I fully understood that at the time, how much it was shaping me, because it didn't feel like a belief I was choosing. It just felt like a pattern I was experiencing. It felt like trying and trying again and adjusting and softening and still walking away from those conversations with the same result, which eventually makes you stop asking, how can I say it better? And start assuming, well, this just isn't going to land the way I mean it anyway. And that's really a quiet shift when it happens, because it doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like adapting. It feels like learning how to move through conversations in a way that creates the least amount of friction, even if it means not fully expressing what you were trying to say in the first place. Not necessarily because I was wrong in every situation, but because that's what the experience reinforced again and again until it became something I expected before the conversation even unfolded. And when you live in that kind of pattern for long enough, you don't just learn how to communicate differently, you start to anticipate the outcome before it ever happens. You begin to expect that what you say might be misunderstood, and you prepare for pushback before there's even a response at all, because your mind has already connected the present moment with what it remembers from the past. So instead of simply responding to what's happening right now, you're also responding to everything that you've learned might happen next. And eventually, that doesn't just shape how you say things, it starts to shape whether you say them at all. Because if the outcome feels predictable, even when it hasn't happened yet, it becomes easier to step back than to keep trying to explain something that may not be received the way that you intended it. And when I look at it now, it makes a lot more sense why my mind goes where it does in moments like that conversation at the table, because it's not just about what's being said right now, it's about everything I learned to expect from what might happen next. And when I started paying attention to how that pattern actually shows up in my life now, I realized it's not just something that appears in bigger conversations or high pressure moments. It's woven into the really ordinary interactions in a way that's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And a lot of it shows up in texting, which sounds small on the surface, but if you've ever sat with your phone in your hand, typing something out and then deleting it a few times before you send it, you know there's more happening there than just choosing the right words. There have been so many moments where I'll read a message and immediately know what I think or feel about it, and then just sit there for a second, staring at the screen, because I'm already thinking about how my response might be received before I even begin to type. So I'll type something out, and then I'll reread it and start adjusting it, softening a phrase here, removing something there, adding a little more explanation so it doesn't come across the wrong way. And by the time I'm done, what I send doesn't actually sound like what I originally meant. It sounds like the version of it that feels the safest to send. And even then, there are moments where I'll still hesitate before hitting send, reading it one more time, trying to anticipate how it might be interpreted on the other side of the screen, because once it's sent, I can't control how it lands. And I think that's the part that makes this feel even heavier, especially when you're communicating through text, because people can't actually hear your heart in your voice. They can't hear your tone. They can't see your expression. They're just reading words on a screen, and those words get filtered through whatever they're carrying into that moment. And if you've ever read a message and immediately thought someone was being short with you or rude or frustrated, and then later realized that it might have not been that way at all, like they didn't even say it in a way that was, upsetting, it's easy for that to happen, because that Sometimes it is what they meant, but a lot of times it isn't. A lot of times it's the tone that we hear because of the mind space that we're already in. Because maybe something else happened earlier that day. Maybe someone said something that rubbed you the wrong way, or you're already frustrated or tired or overwhelmed, and without even realizing it, you read that message through whatever you're already feeling. So even if the other person took the time to soften what they were trying to say, and to be thoughtful with their words, to say it in the kindest way that they knew how, it can still land differently depending on what the other person is bringing into that moment. And when you think about that, it highlights something that's hard to accept, especially if you're someone who puts a lot of effort into communicating carefully. You can say something with the right intention. You can say it with the most care. You can even say it in a way that you've thought through multiple times to make sure it doesn't come across the wrong way, and it can still be interpreted differently than you meant it. Not because you did it wrong, but because you're not the only one in the conversation. And that's the part that's the hardest to sit with, because if you've been carrying the belief that you can control how something lands if you just say it in the right way, moments like that change that idea in a way that's uncomfortable, because they remind you that no matter how carefully you communicate, you're still not in control of how it's received. And if you've ever stared at a message after you've sent it, rereading it in your mind and trying to hear it the way that the other person might hear it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment where nothing has actually happened yet, but you're already trying to interpret the response that hasn't even come. You see those 3 little dots on the screen and you're just waiting for the shoe to drop. And that's the tension underneath it all. It's not about saying something clearly. It's about wanting to manage how it's been received. And I see that same pattern show up in conversations too, just in a different way, where I can know exactly what I think in the moment, but instead of saying it, I'll hold on to it and come back to it later, telling myself that I'm just trying to make sure I'm not reacting emotionally, or that I'm taking the time to process before I respond. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's also a way of giving myself more time to figure out how to say something in a way that won't create tension. It won't be misunderstood, or it won't cause the other person to respond in a way that feels uncomfortable to navigate. So instead of responding in the moment, I'll revisit it hours later, sometimes even days later, trying to bring it back into a conversation that has already moved on. And by that point, it can feel disconnected, like I'm responding to something that doesn't quite exist in the same way anymore, which often means the response itself doesn't land the way I intended it to anyway. And sometimes the person's even forgotten about it by then. And when you step back and look at it, it's really not about timing, it's about control. It's about trying to create the version of the conversation where the outcome feels predictable. And I think that's where this gets a little more honest for me, because if you really look at it, or if I really look at it, I don't just want to express something clearly. I want it to be received clearly, understood in the way that I meant it, and to land without creating confusion or tension or distance. And in some ways, that's not a bad desire. Of course, we want to be understood, and of course, we care about how our words affect the people that we're talking to. But when that desire turns into a sense of responsibility for how the other person feels, interprets, or responds, it starts to create a kind of pressure that's impossible to carry. Because now it's not just about what I say, it's about managing the entire outcome of the conversation. And that's not something that I can actually control. And it doesn't always stop me from trying anyway. And that's where I start to see how deeply this has shaped the way I show up. Because it doesn't just stay in how I phrase things. It shows up in how much I say, or how directly I say it, and sometimes whether I even say it at all. There are times when I'll soften something so much, it doesn't even sound like a different perspective anymore. It just sounds like an agreement. Not because I actually agree, but because that version of the response feels less likely to create a reaction that I don't know how to navigate. And in those moments, it's easy to tell myself that I'm just being kind or thoughtful or trying to keep the peace. But if I'm really honest, Sometimes it's not just trying to keep the peace, it's trying to control the outcome. And I have a feeling that this isn't just something that I experience. It might not look the same in your life, it might not sound the same in your head, but there's a good chance that you felt some internal tension where it's not just about what you're going to say, it's about everything you think might happen after you say it. Where you find yourself thinking ahead, trying to anticipate how something might land, or how it might be interpreted, or how it might affect the relationship in that moment, and adjusting what you say based on what you believe the safest outcome might be. And over time, that can start to feel like wisdom. It can feel like maturity. It can even feel like you're being loving because you're taking the other person into account and trying not to create unnecessary tension or misunderstanding. And in some ways, that's true. We are called to be thoughtful with our words. We're called to speak in a way that reflects love and patience and care for people that we're talking to. But there's a difference between speaking with wisdom and carrying the responsibility for the outcome. And that's where this starts to get a little more honest, especially for those of us who care deeply about the people in our lives and genuinely don't want to harm them. Because if you spend a lot of time learning how to read people, how to anticipate reactions, how to adjust yourself to keep things steady, it can really be easy to step into a role that was never actually yours to carry. Not just speaking with care, but trying to manage how what you say is received, trying to present or prevent misunderstanding before it happens. Trying to soften something enough that it won't create a reaction that you don't know how to navigate. And when you're living in that space, it doesn't just affect what you say, it affects whether you even say it at all. Because if there's a chance, even the slightest chance, that honesty could create tension or distance or a shift in the relationship, it can feel safer to adjust your words, delay the conversation, or avoid it altogether rather than risk stepping into something you can't control. And that's where this begins to intersect with something we talk a lot about in faith, which is the idea of speaking truth in love. Because for a lot of us, that sounds simple in theory, but in real life, it's not so simple at all. It means saying something that is honest and aligned with what you believe to be true, while also holding a posture of love towards that other person. But it doesn't come with any guarantee of how that person is going to respond or receive it. And that's the part that can feel the hardest. Because if your instinct has always been to manage the outcome, to keep the peace, or to make sure things land well, then stepping into a moment where you speak honestly without controlling the response can feel like stepping into uncertainty. It can feel risky. It can feel like you're putting something valuable on the line, especially if the relationship matters to you. And I think for a lot of us, the hesitation isn't just about finding the right words. It's about what might change if we say them, what might shift in the dynamic, how the other person might interpret it, whether they'll receive it in the way that we intended, or whether it'll create tension that we don't know how to resolve. And when you've lived long enough with the belief that you're somehow responsible for how things land, it makes sense that this would feel extra heavy. It makes sense that you would pause. It makes sense that you would filter. It makes sense that you would try to get it right before you say it. But there's a point where the responsibility starts to weigh more than it was ever meant to. Because speaking truth in love doesn't mean controlling how it's received. It means being faithful with how you speak. And those are not the same thing. And I think this is the part where it doesn't resolve as quickly as we might want it to. Because even when you start to understand the difference between being responsible for how you speak and being responsible for how it's received, that doesn't automatically remove the feeling that you still are. There's a part of me that can look at this logically and say, I know I'm not responsible for how someone reacts, and at the same time still feel the weight of what that reaction might be. And those things don't cancel each other out. They exist side by side. So it's like there's this clean shift where suddenly I say exactly what I think in every situation without hesitation or without any awareness of how it might land. it's not like there's this clean shift. Sorry. It's much quieter than that. And honestly, it's a lot more gradual than I would probably prefer. It looks like catching myself in those moments where I start to move from step 1 to step 12. And instead of following that pattern all the way through, choosing to stay a little more present than what's actually happening right now, or in what's happening right now. It looks like noticing the instinct to soften something to the point it no longer reflects what I really think, and pausing long enough to ask myself whether I'm being thoughtful or whether I'm trying to manage the outcome. And sometimes it looks like saying something anyway. And I can think of moments, even recently, where that's exactly what it looked like, where I felt the familiar hesitation rise up, where I could feel myself starting to calculate how something might land. And instead of going quiet or adjusting to the safest version, I just stayed in it a little longer than I normally would have. Not long enough to feel completely comfortable, just long enough not to disappear. And even in those moments, there's still this awareness running underneath everything, where I can feel my body bracing slightly, almost waiting for the response, trying to read the tone, the expression, or even the silence in a way that tells me whether I handled it well or not. And that's part that's still shifting and shaping for me. Not just saying something honestly, but allowing it to exist without immediately trying to evaluate how it was received. Not perfectly, and definitely not without feeling it, but honestly. Even in those moments where there's still a part of me that braces a little, waiting to see how it's going to be received, because when you spent years anticipating reactions, your body doesn't just unlearn that overnight. And I have a feeling that's not just my experience. I think for a lot of us, this is where the tension really sits. Not in understanding what's true, but in learning how to live it out in real time when the outcome is still unknown. Because it's one thing to say, I'm not responsible for how someone responds, and it's another thing to actually release that responsibility when the relationship matters to you. And I think that's the part that deserves a little more honesty, because it's easy to talk about this in a way that sounds clear and resolved. Like once you understand what's true, the next step should feel obvious. But when the relationship actually matters to you, when it's someone that you care about and you want to stay connected to, there's a very real part of you that understands what you're risking by stepping into that kind of honesty. Not because you're trying to create distance, but because you know that it could. And not in a dramatic way, not in a way where everything falls apart all at once, but in the quieter way that relationships sometimes shift when something honest is said and received differently than it was intended, where the tone changes slightly, where something feels a little more distant, and where you're wondering if that moment mattered more than you meant for it to. And that doesn't just make you weak for feeling that, it makes you aware of what's at stake. When you care about a person, when you don't want to create distance or tension or misunderstanding, and when you know that you're about to say something that might shift everything, even if you're saying it with love, that's not a small thing. And I think sometimes we skip past that too quickly, telling ourselves that if something is true, it should feel easy to do. When in reality, there are moments where doing the right thing still feels uncomfortable. There are moments where speaking honestly still feels risky. There are moments where growth doesn't feel empowering, it feels costly. And that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It just means you're doing something differently than you've done it before. And maybe that's what this looks like more often than we expect. Not where everything feels settled and clear, but a quieter kind of growth where you begin to notice the difference between trying to control what happens next and choosing to be faithful in what you say right now. I don't think this is something that we outgrow overnight. It would be easy to think that once you understand the difference between being responsible for how you speak and being responsible for how it's received, everything should start to feel clear and straightforward. Like you can just step into conversations differently and trust that it will all work itself out. But what I'm really learning is that it doesn't usually feel that clean. Because even when you know what's true, There can still be a part of you that feels the weight of what might happen when you live it out. There can still be hesitation that shows up in real time, not because you don't know what to say, but because you care about what it might create. And that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're learning to live differently than you did before. Because for a long time, it may have felt like your responsibility didn't end with what you said. It extended into how it was received, how it was interpreted, and how it affected the relationship. So, of course, it feels uncomfortable to step away from that. Of course, it feels like something is at stake. Of course, there's a part of you that still wants to manage the outcome, even when you know you can't. But I think this is where the shift begins. Not in having all the right words, and not in controlling how those words are received, but in choosing how to be faithful in how you speak and trusting God with what happens next. And that doesn't mean you won't still feel it. It just means you're not letting that feeling decide for you anymore. And maybe that's what this looks like more often than we expect. And maybe for you, this doesn't show up in big conversations. Maybe it shows up in a text that you haven't sent yet, or something you said halfway that you didn't fully finish, or a moment where you chose the safer version of what you were thinking instead of the honest one. Not a sudden confidence where everything feels settled and easy, but a quieter kind of growth where you begin to recognize the difference between trying to control what happens next and choosing to be faithful with what you say right now. If this resonated, you might want to sit with episode 20, why you don't trust your voice in the moment, or maybe devotional 18, God is still working. They hold similar themes in a different way. Thank you for being here with me today. I don't take it lightly that you spend your time in this space. I hope that you felt like this is a place where you could slow down enough to recognize something that maybe you hadn't fully put words to before. If you're someone who wants a place to go next with this, somewhere you can sit with it a little longer or explore at your own pace, I did build that intentionally over on the Healer and Hope Giver website, which is www.healerhopegiver.com. That's healerhopegiver.com. It's set up to feel a little more like a guided experience than just a collection of content, so you can start wherever you are. There's a Start Here path if you're newer to this space, and the full podcast library if you want to keep listening, the Quiet Authority devotional if you want something to walk through over a few days, and the companion guides if you're someone who processes things best by writing things out. Everything is there designed to meet you where you are and give you that next step that feels manageable and not overwhelming. And as always, if this episode connected with you, the simplest way to stay with this space is to follow or subscribe wherever you listen, whether it's Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or even on YouTube, where these episodes are available as well. That just makes following just makes sure that the new episodes show up for you each week without you having to go look for them. And if something in this episode or any episode resonates with you, I would love to hear about it. You can message me or even email me through social media or the Healer and Hope Giver website. I read every single message. And if you know someone who might need this conversation, sharing the episode or even a short clip is a really meaningful way to help them find it. Every share helps this to reach the people that need it most. And until next time, you don't have to get this perfect. You don't have to rush the process. You're allowed to learn how to be faithful in what you say and trust God with what happens next.